Saturday, but 14-year-old shot his family in Alabama. Oh yeah, it's a horrible story. Shot and killed 5 members of his family. 14-year-old, 9mm pistol. If you were watching the news on Saturday, what happened on Saturday? Oh, the guy got fired from his job. It upset him so much. Well, something upset him. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. Something upset him, and he jumped in his car and started blasting away at people on the street. Killed 9, I think, and wounded 20. He was able to drive 20 miles away. He got in his car, and evidently the police stopped him, and he had called 911. They stopped him because he didn't use his turn signal. As odd as that seems. Anyway, he took off, started shooting people, shot a postal carrier, and stole her vehicle. Shot and killed her, stole her vehicle. He was shooting some kind of an assault weapon. I think it was an AR-15. Anyway, that happened on Saturday. And yesterday, the guy blew away his family. 14-year-old decided things weren't nice at home. Anyway, so bad stuff is still going on. Texas seems to be hit more often than anybody else, strangely enough. They had the shooting in El Paso, of course. They had the shooting at the church just north of San Antonio. And the guy this is in Odessa, Midland, Odessa. If you've ever seen the movie Friday Night Lights or television show, it's about a football team from Odessa. Odessa's the poor. It's like poor town's rich town. Midland is the rich town, and Odessa is the poor town. It's where all the roustabouts and whatnot. People work in the oil fields. They all live in Odessa. And all the people that own the oil fields, they all live in Midland.
So do you think if they change the gun laws that these type of shootings will decrease? Or increase or, I mean, is this just, well, it's the gun law, right? People have access to these guns, so they commit these mass murders?
Well, they're able to shoot a lot of people because we have no control over how many bullets they can hold in their gun and whatnot. The magazines hold, well, they can hold up to 100 rounds of ammunition.
So how do you feel about the gun laws?
I think, I don't like, having been military, I don't like the idea that we have military weapons on our street. It just doesn't make sense to me.
I had a conversation with somebody about that. He kind of got mad at me. It wasn't an easy conversation to have in the first place.
Sure.
But I was like, what if they started to at least do more background checks and make sure the person's actually sane to actually get a gun? He goes, no, that's not going to work. And I'm like, what's going to work? Why not just ban guns altogether? He goes, but that's the way we overthrow the government. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, let's overthrow the government.
He was saying that it's a right that we can overthrow the government if we need to, and that's why we have guns. I'm like, this was like back in what, 1800s, where this
17th,
yeah,
18th century.
So his reasoning is still way in the past.
Way out. Okay, well, we won't. We can't really debate that. This is going to come up again in what we're talking about. So we will talk about gun laws and what can be done and whether it's going to help. Strangely enough, they had the shooting in Odessa, and 2 hours later, after the shooting, on the 1st of September, their gun laws changed. But they became more conservative. They allowed they have a gun law, they had a law before that you couldn't have a weapon on a school grounds, and now, of course, you can. They also increased the number of police that are armed on campuses. What else did they do?
But are they armed with the AR-15s, just like?
Oh, no, my goodness, no. I mean, you're not walking around with submachine guns.
How are you
slung
gonna
over
outgun a
the-
person that has an AR-15?
You get a 9mm pistol, I guess. If you can get close enough to him, you might be able to hit him. As much fun as that is. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about psychologists who deal with the law. Applied scientists seek to do research to solve real-life problems. Psychologists may testify as an expert witness and have testified in such cases as employee discrimination through selection and promotion procedures. You know, Daddy's son, the family was given a promotion, but this individual couldn't get a promotion because he's not a member of the family. The effects of posting warning signs or safety instructions on potentially dangerous equipment. Of course, that is always there. Does it work? Well, it reminds people that they need to be careful. The factors that may cause a suspect to make a false confession. And of course, we do have problems with false confessions. Why somebody wants to confess to a crime they didn't commit is very questionable. But the reality is, of course, it happens all the time, and it really confuses the police. The effects of suggestion, usually what will happen in a crime, the police will hold back some information. They'll put out some information, but they'll hold back critical pieces of information. How many shots hit the victim? Where was the victim found? You know, that kind of information the police will hold back so that if somebody makes a false confession, they can determine whether the individual actually did it or not. Some people lose their will to live, and that's why they make false confessions. They want to be notorious. That's why they make false confessions. It's suicide by police. It's another form of suicide. And it is a form of mental illness, of course. There are individuals that will confess to lots of crimes, and of course, the police know who they are. And so when they come in and make a confession, they know that it's bogus. The effects of suggestive questions on children's memory of alleged abuse, and of course, this can be a really serious problem. Children claiming that they were abused when they weren't abused. Sometimes it's dreams that they're remembering. Sometimes it's a story that they're remembering. My own grandson was, he went to visit my wife the other day and to sleep over, and he was afraid of the house, and he was saying, but there's murderers out there. And he thought that they were going to come out of the corn and murder him. And she convinced him that the dog would bark. She had a baseball bat and that would take care of the murderers. But he had seen a movie, and the movie had made such an impression on him that he was sure that he was going to be murdered in his sleep, so he didn't want to go to sleep at the farmhouse. Evidently, he'd seen a movie where they came crawling out of the corn or whatever. Anyway. So children's memories aren't always real. And he claimed it was a real thing. But of course, it was just a movie that he probably shouldn't have seen. And his other grandmother let him see. The idiot. Ethics of the psychologist as an expert witness. An expert witness is usually hired and paid by one side. So when they look at the evidence, of course, they see it from the side of the individual giving them their money. They are still responsible for reporting all of their conclusions, whether it favors the people paying them or not. So when they get on the stand, Usually they will testify the way they're supposed to testify, but what they're really supposed to do is look at the case and testify what they see, not what they're paid to see. When experts are blinded, this is bringing in an expert where they're not being paid by either side or they're being paid by the state. If they're blinded, of course, they're more likely to give testimony that's accurate. Each state maintains standards to determine whether testimony of an expert can be used in court. And of course, each state is different. And this is one of the things that you have to remember. When we're talking about laws, most of the laws that we're dealing with are state laws, not really federal laws. And if they are state laws, each state can make their laws whatever they want. And so this is, so a psychologist in Alabama is probably not, and they go into a court of law, it's going to be completely different than if they go into a court of law in New York City. Most of what we see as far as law is concerned have to do with either California or New York. And that's because most of the television comes out of California and New York. So a lot of people think that all the laws, most of the television shows are out of California, and they are written by people in California. So when they're talking about laws, they think that whatever California says is federal law. But that's not the way it is. They have first-degree murder in California. In other states, they don't have first-degree murder. In some states, they have second-degree murder. In other states, they have manslaughter. And there's kind of a difference between the two, even though they kind of almost just about mean the same thing. So it really all depends on the state that you're living in as to, or the state where you murder somebody as to how you're going to be tried. Some states don't have the death penalty. The worst state to murder somebody is Texas, because Texas executes more people than all the other states put together. They're number one. Okay. So it's a bad place to kill somebody. Another bad state to kill somebody is Florida, because they execute a lot of people as well. Policy Evaluator of Law provides data to answer the questions, and there's lots of different questions that they have to answer. These are just some examples. How do I know that the policy I have instituted is effective? The gun laws, of course, would be one of those. Right now, the gun laws are really lax. Background checks are not universal. As far as the federal government is concerned, they do have databases, but the databases aren't connected to all the states. So if somebody breaks a law or is a felon in select states, then it's difficult to determine whether they are a felon in that state. So what they have to do, if you're doing a background check, you have access to about 45 different states. Then you have to call the other states, or you have to contact the other states in order to find out if the person's a felon in those select states. You would think that all of this would be tied in with the FBI, but when they changed the gun laws back in the 90s, in 1994 they had some fairly strict gun laws. One of them had to do with how many bullets you could have in a magazine. I think the limit was 13, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, you didn't have any automatic weapons. Bump stocks were illegal. It was illegal to make a weapon, an automatic weapon at the time. All those laws changed. I mean, they all fell by the wayside. And what Congress did, as interesting as this is, well, one of the things that Congress did when they were changing the gun laws, they said that the federal government couldn't accumulate statistics on gun violence. As stupid as that sounds. Why would they do that? Well, because they were afraid that the gun lobby lobbied for them not to accumulate these statistics. So they passed a law that you couldn't accumulate all these statistics. A lot of this information comes into the FBI, but not all information comes into the FBI. The states have to do with providing information to the federal government, but states have to write the law that the counties have to give them this information, and some states don't have those laws. Alabama's a good example. Alabama, if you commit a crime in Tuscaloosa County, over in the western portion of the state, that information will probably not make it to the state, statisticians, who will not be able to give it to the federal government. So those kinds of laws, or those kinds of felonies are just, they just kind of drop away. So how do I know that the policy I have instituted is effective? Well, you get a psychologist, and a psychologist tries to determine, they will write some kind of research, and they'll conduct some form of research to determine if it's effective. How do I design a change in my organization that I can measure whether it works? And of course, once again, research done by a psychologist. Will chemical castration of rapists reduce the number of sexual assaults? When my sister was going through law school, when she's going through law school, this is what she suggested. They chemically castrate rapists so that they can't assault anyone anymore. And what they determined was it would reduce it by a very small percentage. And the reason is because a lot of times rape has to do with more with anger than sex. So they'll just do damage to the individual. And a lot of times when they put the person in a situation where they would be raped, they don't rape them at all, they just physically assault them and mutilate them or whatever. That's one of the things that they determined. But she was trying to write a law back in the 60s, or 70s, I'm sorry, back in the 70s about chemical castration. But of course it didn't fly. My sister worked for the state of Indiana. She wrote laws that dealt with stalking, with child abuse, and with, they didn't have laws that dealt with stalking, child abuse, or spousal abuse. Initially it was wife abuse that she wrote the law for. Then she found out that I had been physically abused by my first wife, and she changed the law to fit spouses so that males could be protected as well as females. Well, changing the number of passengers allowed in teen drivers' cars reduce the number of accidents. That has been proposed, and that's one of the laws in select states. If you're a teenage driver, you can't have more than 3 people in your car, and you're not allowed to drive after dark in some states. It gets really kind of interesting. Each state develops their own driving laws. Some states you can start driving, if you live on a farm, you can start driving at 14, but you can only drive farm equipment and farm trucks. You can start taking lessons at 15. You could be a student driver at 15 and get your license at 16. That's the way it is in most states. But it all depends on whether it's a farming state or not. Some farming states force you or allow you to start driving at 13 or 14, depending on what's going on. So they're not going to arrest you for driving your tractor down the road, or the farm truck with all the grain in the back. That kind of thing.
Wouldn't that be more dangerous than like driving a vehicle?
What?
A tractor? I mean...
No, they're big and they're slow. Does that sound more dangerous to you?
I don't know. Yeah?
No. Well,
Actually, it could be because a lot of slow drivers cause accidents with fatal episodes.
not in farm.
Well, maybe not in farm country, but
Yeah, well, in farm country, you got to be knowledgeable about the fact that there may be a tractor in front of you, because especially during harvest season, or planting season, or plowing season, or disking season, or hoeing season,
Disking season.
there's a lot of tractors on the road. It's not as bad now as it used to be. In the old days, the tractors were smaller, and there were a lot of kids driving these tractors. Now the tractors are huge. They're like the size of semis. I mean, they're gigantic, and they've got these these plows you wouldn't believe on the back of them. Not plows, I'm sorry, chisel plows. They have chisel plows, but they also have discs in order to prepare the field for planting. Anyway, that's where I live. I live out in the middle of farming country. And it's like this. So you never know what's coming up. So if you're stupid and you don't think about a tractor being on the other side of the hill, you may run into the back end of it. Of course, you're going to hurt you a lot more than you hurt him because he weighs a lot more than you do, unless you're driving a semi. Then it would be a pretty good accident. Anyway, so depending on the state. But if you live in Arizona where you guys don't do very much farming, you don't have the same laws that they have in Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, through the Corn Belt. So the laws are a little bit different. They need to be different. Potentially you could send your kids to school at different times during the year. But if you live in farm country, then you need to plant in the spring. So you need to be a little bit more liberal about that so the kids can get out and help. Anyway, but you guys don't have to worry about that because you don't have that many farmers in your state. Will increasing police foot patrols improve community relationships? These are all questions that psychologists can answer by doing research. Psychologists were tasked with determining whether long-term administration segregation was effective or determined detrimental to inmates. They compared the psychological deterioration of inmates segregated with those allowed in the general population. In other words, if we isolate these individuals, will it cause mental deterioration? That was the idea. They evaluated whether mentally ill patients deteriorated faster than when they were segregated, and this is what they determined. The segregated group and the mentally ill group showed elevated levels of anxiety, depression, hostility, anger, psychosis, and withdrawal alienation. But the segregated group did not show deterioration over time as expected. So isolating people doesn't hurt people. There was once upon a time, there was an actor by the name of Elijah Cook Jr. If you've ever seen Maltese Falcon, he's the gunsel. He's the guy in a raincoat with 45 in each pocket. Elijah Cook Jr. What else is he in? He's also in The Big Sleep. He's the guy that they poisoned at the end. Now I've given you the whole plot of It's a Big Sleep. Anyway, Elijah Cook Jr. was kind of an interesting fellow. He was married twice. He married the same woman twice and another woman once, but he never lived with his wives. And the reason he never lived with his wives is because he lived in a cabin in the woods, way up in the Sierra Nevadas. He hunted and fished, and that's where he got his food. He planted gardens during the summertime, and if they needed him to act, they'd send a courier up to his cabin, and he would come down and play his part, and then he'd go back. He did this all of his life, lived to be 91 years old, but he was a recluse, and he never lived with any of his wives. Theoretically, he did have children, but they're not exactly sure. They're not exactly sure. He was in the Army during World War II, and he said he had dependents, so that would be his children, but nobody knows who his dependents were, as curious as that is. This guy was a recluse, and he was an actor, and he seemed fairly sane, but he segregated himself. He put himself in confinement, and he didn't interact with other individuals. Can you be sane and be a recluse or a hermit? Is that possible? Or is that a form of mental illness?
I don't think it's mental illness.
It certainly wasn't for Elijah Cook. So some of these individuals, they don't suffer from being alone. The Birdman of Alcatraz is a good example. He was a solitary confinement for decades. And he worked with birds, and he wrote all kinds of interesting treatises on birds and how they developed. Both the general population group and segregated group showed the same pattern of change over time. So they did not deteriorate. It did not cause mental illness for these individuals. And that's what the psychologists determined by looking at these individuals. As curious as that is. The ethics of the policy evaluator is the same as that of an expert witness. They must adhere to the principles of the scientific process. And of course, they will publish their findings, and at that point, other psychologists will be able to read it, and they will be able to say whether it is accurate or not. One of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing as far as article critiques is that it's up to you guys to decide whether this is good research. It should always be up to you when you're reading a piece of research. Just because it's research doesn't make it good. I know some people get upset when I say that, but they're all gone now. They've all quit, so we won't worry about that, getting upset. Not all research is good. Just because you did it doesn't mean that it's good research. Some research just doesn't fit. It just didn't happen. You had a prejudiced or a biased population or sample. And these kinds of things we need to determine when we read the articles. So if you look at inmates in Alabama, are they the same as inmates at any place else in the United States? Well, potentially not. Potentially not. Just because somebody lives in California, does that make that a broad spectrum of individuals that you could do your research on? Yes, ma'am.
So does it become a biased research if we're limited to where we can collect our samples?
Oh, it can. It can bias your results. I did research up in Montana with a native population in Montana. Could I generalize that to a native population in the Southwest? These are all tall basketball players. They're really tall up there. The Crow are really tall people. The Sioux, not so much, but Gros-Ventre, Blackfeet, they're all really tall people. So, I mean, that's a question that you have to ask yourself. Just because I did research on a native population in Montana, does that mean I can make a broad statement about all natives in the United States? For one thing, it was mostly a rural population. It wasn't an urban population at all. But over half the population, the native population in the United States are urban. They're urban Indians. They're people that live in Phoenix, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. Are they the same as you guys living here on this reservation? No? They're not the same? They look the same.
I would expect similarities, but I would not expect identical anything because the mindset here is different or can be different
Sure.
from another tribe, another location. We live on the high desert. They might live in the mountains, and so their culture is going to be
Totally
different from here.
Any urban setting is going to be different from a rural setting.
But the similarities could be, more to the ethics and the beliefs of the tribes.
So what could you possibly say about research that was done on a native population in an urban setting? What connections, could you make connections between a rural group and an urban group? They're both native.
And so,
Yeah. So what could you say? That's the question. What could you say? Is there anything that you can say?
well, I have friends that are in different tribes, and the similarities are the focus on family, focus on education, focus on living a Western style,
Western?
living Western, meaning non-native.
Yeah, you're not talking about
Stuff.
cowboys and Indian things.
But Other similarities can be those who prefer living rural on the reservation, who prefer living traditionally.
So you're going to get a different mindset.
You're going to get a totally different mindset.
Sure. And different tribes have different mindsets.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. What was I? Oh, there's a group of Athabascan-speaking people who don't eat fish. They don't fish. They're Apaches. They're not all the Apaches. It's just select groups. They don't eat fish. As confusing as that is, but if you go to the Southwest, they eat a lot of salmon. In the Northwest, I'm sorry, in the Northwest. Because they're river tribes, they're mountain tribes. If you go to Wisconsin, the Ojibwe and the Anishinaabe, which are actually kind of the same tribe, the Chippewa, they eat a lot of rice, wild rice, which isn't rice at all, it's grass. They eat that brown rice stuff. They eat a lot of fish. Mohawk have fishing rights in upper New York State that other tribes don't. So, you're dealing with a lot of different ways of looking at the world. A forensic evaluator in litigation is a psychologist secured to evaluate individuals in civil and criminal cases, to evaluate competence of a defendant, the mental state of a defendant at the time of the incident, were they temporarily insane, the degree of emotional or brain damage suffered by a victim, effects on a child of alternative custody arrangements after a divorce, the risk of future violent or criminal behavior, the prospect of a convicted defendant's rehabilitation in prison or on probation. And as I told you, I was working as a consultant dealing with sex crimes, and we had to determine whether those individuals would commit another crime, whether it was rape. Usually it was child abuse. They were pedophiles. We had to determine if it was going to happen again. The problem with a pedophile is that's their sexual orientation. The probability that they're going to do it again is relatively high. Normally, it's relatively high. That's the norm. It's abnormal for them to change their orientation. As you can imagine, just think about trying to have sex with somebody else, with another individual that doesn't have anything to do with the people that you're attracted to. These guys are attracted to children. And how in the world do you condition that out of somebody? And the answer is you can't. It would be just like you trying to change your own sexual orientation. It's nigh on to impossible.
Would that kind of be like somebody who's an addict or an alcoholic? Like, they'll just kind of have that, I guess, it's always going to be there, but you just have to kind of go through therapy and work.
This is deeper than that. I mean, your sexual orientation has to do with hormones. It has to do with ideas that you had when you were 3 and 4 and 5 years old. That's the way. That's the way. But alcohol has to do with when you're a teenager, or has to do, or shooting up with heroin has to do with you being an adult, and you saying this is a lot more fun than going home and watching television. But sexual orientation goes deeper than that. It goes back from the very beginning.
So like a pedophile, I'm saying to not act out in those behaviors.
Right.
So
And that's the best we can do.
it's just like go to therapy and stuff? I'm saying
Well, that's
like
what we
how
do,
would
yeah, and
we-
they have to go through continual therapy. And usually that's what we tell them that they have to do, is that, we have to release them from prison because the crime is only 10 to 15 years. So we have to release them from prison, but we can dictate that they have to go to therapy. And in therapy, we try to condition them to not act out on their sexual desires. As weird as that sounds. Okay, so that's what a forensic evaluator does. As horrible as that sounds. Two different ways that mental health professionals become involved in litigation as a forensic evaluator. One, they are either court-appointed or they are hired by one of the parties involved in the litigation. Usually the defense or the prosecution, sometimes it's by the plaintiff themselves. And this is what you would have seen if Jeffrey Epstein had committed suicide. What you would see is, you would see the prosecution evaluating him, you'd see the defense evaluating him, and he would have hired somebody because he's a multimillionaire and owns, what, 3 jet airplanes and an island in the Bahamas, which is being blasted right now, by the way. His private island. It's almost been leveled. Anyway, he was so wealthy that he could have hired any number of expert witnesses or forensic psychologists to come in and say that he wasn't really trafficking. He had odd sexual desires. Most of the women were actually of age, and or if they weren't, he didn't know it. That kind of thing.
Or that he's the victim.
Yes, he's a victim himself. A forensic mental health examination cannot take place unless it is approved by the court. So it really wouldn't make any difference. The courts, and of course, now we're dealing with 2 different jurisdictions. Initially, he was arrested in Florida, and he was convicted in Florida. But this last time he was arrested in New York. And of course, they had to wait until he came to the state of New York before they could arrest him, and that's what happened. He landed at Kennedy Airport, and they seized him at that point. Of course, he landed in his private jet, and they told him that he had to go through customs, so he had to go into the airport. And when he came into the airport, they arrested him at customs, and that's how they got him. And he knew he was in a world of hurt because he knew that the laws in the state of New York were much more stringent than they were in Florida. He had been able to buy off the people down in Florida, but he wasn't going to be able to buy off the people in New York. No area of psychology is as regulated as that of the forensic evaluator. They must not only comply with APA code, the Code of Ethics, but also the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists. This was passed these guidelines were passed in 2012. The guidelines for child custody evaluations in family law proceedings, and these, of course, were written in 2010. So the forensic evaluator has to follow 3 different ethical codes, not just the ethical codes of the APA. Forensic evaluators must provide evaluations that are clear in their purpose. They are conducted by the individuals who are competent by virtue of their education, training, and experience, respectful of appropriate relationships, avoid multiple relationships. In other words, they can't have a relationship with any of the individuals that they're dealing with. They can't have a friendship relationship. They can't have a sexual relationship with anybody that they're evaluating. Provide the appropriate level of confidentiality. I use methods that are accurate, current, and consistent with science and standards of practice. And this, of course, these things change over time. What was the standard of practice in the 1950s was not the standard of practice in the 1980s and 1990s. Remember the Tarasoff case. Once upon a time, if you're a psychologist, then everything was confidential. You didn't have to tell anybody anything. Then all of a sudden, the Tarasoff case happened in the 1970s, and now all of a sudden, if somebody's going to kill somebody, you have to tell somebody. Before, it was all private. A profession that doesn't have to give that information out would be lawyers. Everything that is told to a lawyer is confidential. They can't disclose any of that information. Even if somebody says, I did it and I'm going to kill somebody else if I am acquitted, they can't tell anybody that. But a psychologist has to tell somebody that. Because if somebody dies and the psychologist knew, then the psychologist is in trouble.
So why does that not apply to lawyers?
That's the law. That's the justice system.
So this law applies only to psychologists, why? Because they can, why does this only apply to psychologists?
It only applies to psychologists because of the Tarasov case. If it hadn't been for the Tarasov case, our ethics would be totally different.
I know, but what was the initial ruling, why?
Because the psychologist knew that the man was dangerous. He actually called security, campus security.
But
to-
does, do lawyers also have that same
No.
information?
No. No. They're not allowed to disclose anything. I mean, otherwise they go into court and say, you know, I was talking to my client the other day, and he said, yeah, I did it. Case over. You know, you can't do that. Even if somebody is guilty, he is, according to the states, the laws in the states of, in the United States, he has the right to a defense, to the best defense he can possibly get. And the only way you can do that is not to admit that he did it, to try to argue strange points of law. And that's the problem, but that's one of the problems that we have. And we're going to talk about this in the next chapter. We have an adversarial form of law. And because we have an adversarial form of law, if we have two individuals, one of you is poor and the other one is wealthy, then the wealthy person can hire the best lawyers in the world. That's what Trump is always saying. Sometimes he breaks the law, but he's never convicted. And the reason he's never convicted is because he has such good lawyers. I told you the case of Bell Telephone. Bell Telephone was ripping off not just the people in the United States, but all the soldiers in the United States military. This is during Vietnam. They were ripping them off, yet they were able to not be charged with anything because they were able to draw the case out for such a long period of time. They were wrong. I mean, justice is justice. The law. The truth was that they ripped us off, and they should have paid us back. We shouldn't have had to pay them so much money. They were ripping us off. But they were able to draw it out for such a long time that by the time they settled the case, they broke up Bell Telephone. I know, that makes me happy. They broke up Bell Telephone. But I didn't get my money back, even though they ripped me off. Not just me, but all the military guys in the United States military, all the Navy guys around Long Beach, all the Marines at Thousand Oaks, in Camp Lejeune. I mean, everybody. They were ripping everybody. Use methods that are accurate. What am I talking about? Oh, confidentiality. Use methods that are accurate, current, and consistent with science. Okay. Communicate appropriately, of course. In the 1970s, this has to do with Phil McGraw. Phil McGraw, the reason that Phil McGraw is famous is because he was Oprah's psychologist. But before he was Oprah's psychologist, he was Oprah's consultant. She was being sued, and they called in Phil McGraw to consult, to select the jury, to help select the jury. And of course, she had lots of conversations with him. He's a very affable fellow, as you can see on television. He was on Oprah for a while, Oprah's television show, and then now he's got a program of his own. Bull, if you've ever seen the television show Bull, it's about Phil McGraw when he was a jury consultant, as strange as that is. So the idea is, if you get a good consulting psychologist, then you can win all of your cases. Because it doesn't have to do with what's right, it doesn't have to do with truth, it has to do with, theoretically, it has to do with justice. And justice is whatever the court decides. That's what justice is, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. So if you get a consultant, a jury consultant, and he selects the right jury, then potentially you can get away with murder or you can get away with just about anything. And that's what jury consultants do. And this was a brand new field. He isn't the first one. He's kind of like Freud. Freud wasn't the first psychologist. Freud worked under Brewer. McGraw worked under another individual, and he was the first. But McGraw's from Texas, and he started working as a jury consultant. Trial consulting has expanded to include jury selection, of course, and if you've ever watched Bull, you see the jury selection. Community attitude surveys, so they plant stories. They try to figure out how the people in the community feel. They test the effectiveness of demonstrative evidence, so they know which evidence to present, which evidence not to present. They provide guidance to attorneys. They prepare witnesses for testimony, and this is what the jury consultant does. Is it a racket? Well, yeah. Turns out that all law is pretty much a racket. It isn't what the truth is, it's whether you win or lose. That's the way the law works. Ethics of consultant in litigation, there is no expectation for impartiality in their role. Your client can be guilty as hell, but you've been hired by that person, so you have to try to get them off. That's the way it works. Psychologists as trial consultants subscribe to the ethical code of attorneys, the ethics code of the American Bar Association, which says that you can't disclose any information about your client. That's against the rules, as bizarre as that sounds. I know. So are there any ethics at all? Well, that's a question, isn't it? Maybe with some lawyers there is ethics. Keep my eye on the time, okay. All right, now let's talk about how the courts work. There are two basic systems used in jurisprudence. The adversarial system, which is the system we have in the United States, and the inquisitorial system. Now you guys have to decide for yourselves which one is better, whether the adversarial system is better or the inquisitorial system is better. The adversarial system was developed in England and involves pitting the defense against the prosecution. We have one lawyer versus the other lawyer. Which one is the best lawyer? And that's why they say if you can afford a good lawyer, you're less likely to go to jail. And it's true. If you've got a good enough lawyer. O.J. Simpson had a really, really good defense team. And they were able to get him off. Did he really murder his ex-wife and Ron Goldman? A lot of people think that he did. And it was because of his defense team that he was able to get off. The judge or the jury listen to both arguments and decide which is the most truthful. They have to decide, but it doesn't really have to do with truth. It doesn't have anything to do with truth. O.J. Simpson was acquitted as a murderer, but he lost a civil case. And because he lost the civil case, he had to pay the Goldman family almost every penny that he ever made. He's out of jail now. He's been in jail. He was never prosecuted. He was never indicted. Yes, he was. He was indicted. He was never convicted of murder, but he was convicted of something that had to do with the civil rights of Ron Goldman, the individual that was not really dating his ex-wife, but he just came over to give her something, and he happened to be there when the murder occurred. As weird as that sounds. But O.J. Simpson was arrested for robbing somebody in Las Vegas, and he spent years in jail, just got out last year. And now he's attacking somebody. I can't remember. He's having a Twitter war with somebody. Trying to think who it was. I don't think it was Donald Trump. Trump likes to have Twitter wars. The inquisitorial system is used in Europe, save for England. So if you go to France, you go to Italy, you go to Germany, it's the inquisitorial system. They do have lawyers in France, Germany, Italy, Norway, Sweden. They do have lawyers, but the lawyers aren't allowed to present the case. What they do is they defend their client. That's what they do. But they don't ask any questions. They don't present a defense. What they do is they try to accumulate information, and then when they are asked questions by the judge, then they have to answer those questions. That's their job, is answering these questions. It's kind of like the individual is being questioned right there on the stand. It's really kind of interesting to watch these kinds of trials as compared to the trials in the United States. There was an individual that was being tried for, she'd murdered, somebody had murdered somebody in Italy. And of course, she went to trial. She was an American. And she and her Swiss boyfriend theoretically murdered this person. So they went to trial. And of course, people in the United States were going, oh my God, this isn't right, this isn't right. This trial isn't going the way it should be going. Because they weren't used to the Inquisitorial System. The judge is the only one that asked questions. The two lawyers didn't say hardly anything. And they were upset that her lawyer wasn't doing a better job at defending her. But her lawyer could only answer questions when he was asked the question by the judge. So people weren't used to seeing this type of a trial. Witnesses and parties in the trial are questioned by the judge. And like I said, the lawyer might not say anything for days unless he's asked a specific question by the judge. Sometimes the judge will talk to the lawyer, and sometimes the judge will talk to the individual that has been accused. All witnesses are court witnesses. None of them are witnesses for the defense or witnesses for the prosecution. That's the way it works in the United States. So when you're putting together a case in the United States, the defense accumulates their witnesses. They have their evidence that supports the defense, and the prosecution, of course, will make their case. In the United States, the way it works in the United States, the prosecution will present their case, the defense will present their case, and then the prosecution will get to rebut whatever the defense said. So the prosecution gets to talk twice, and the defense only gets to talk one time in the United States. That's how the adversarial system works. But usually the prosecution is the state. So the state gets a little bit of a leg up. They get to talk twice, where everybody else only gets, or the defense only gets to talk once. The adversarial system is used in the United States. The criticism of it, it's a competitive atmosphere that can distort the truth. And that's what they said about the O.J. Simpson case. We have some national cases where everybody is really interested in what happened. One was the O.J. Simpson case. O.J. Simpson was a popular football player. He ran in the Olympics. He used to hold all the running records in the NFL. Then he was an actor. He was a very popular actor. He was on commercials. So everybody knew who O.J. was. And then all of a sudden his wife and Ron Goldman end up dead. Not just dead, but I mean, he slit her throat to the extent, somebody slit his ex-wife's throat to the extent that her head almost fell off. He had cut through her all the way down to her vertebrae. So that's a pretty good cut if you understand how these things work. Anyway, what was I talking about? We're talking about, distort the truth. Okay. So we have this really popular actor, and of course the case is being tried in California because that's where the murder took place, and everybody's watching. Afterwards, after he was acquitted, there were riots in the street in Los Angeles. Another case that was really nationally popular was the Casey Anthony case. Casey Anthony's gorgeous little 4-year-old daughter suddenly disappeared. They couldn't find her. She's begging people to give her information about her baby, and then eventually they find the child's body. He was wrapped in plastic and dumped in the swamp. This is in Florida. So everybody was really interested in the Casey Anthony case because it looked like, well, there were a lot. The story is really kind of interesting. While she was looking for her daughter, she was also partying fairly hard all night long and having her picture taken with her laughing and whatnot. Anyway, it was a really interesting case. The benefits of the adversarial system. The adversarial system have been shown to lead, systems have been shown to lead to less biased decisions that were more likely to be seen as fair by the parties in dispute. If we're talking about the inquisitorial system, the judge gets to decide what's going to happen. Maybe the judge has decided before the case even takes place that this guy's guilty. So he's just going to throw the book at him. But it usually doesn't happen in a jury trial in the adversarial system. You can potentially win your case even though it doesn't look all that good for you. Participants have plenty of opportunities to present their version of the facts so that they feel that they have been treated fairly. In the inquisitorial system, if he asks you the question, then you get to answer it. If he never asks you the question, this evidence never comes out. That's the way the inquisitorial system works. But in an adversarial system, whatever your story is gets to come out because you get to present your case. The defense gets to present their case, the prosecutor gets to present their case, and then the jury decides which one sounds more believable to them. All right. Laws are designed to specify precisely what conduct is illegal, often referred to as black letter laws. When you're driving down the road and it says 55 miles per hour, that's a black letter law. The speed limit's 55. So if the police stop you and you're going 56 miles an hour, you're speeding. If they stop you and you're going, they probably won't stop you if you're going 56. But if you're going 70, they potentially will stop you. If you're going 80, they'll stop you. And in some states, it's $10 for every mile per hour over the speed limit. So.
I got a ticket for driving 33 miles an hour in a 30 mile per hour.
Where were you?
This is in Monticello. They have that business district. And that costs us a lot to get a speeding ticket.
So you had to pay $30 fine.
No, it was a $200 fine. In addition to that, it also had an effect on my insurance.
Of course it did.
And that increased by an extra $200.
You're a criminal.
Can you imagine 30
I can.
in a 30-mile lane?
I'm shocked.
So,
You're such a bad person. 33 and a 30. Oh, my goodness. It'll take me a minute to get over this. These are known as black letter laws. You can't murder someone. You can't kill somebody. If somebody dies, then they have to look at the situation. There is such thing as self-defense, but it still has to go to trial. They still have to determine if it has to go to a grand jury. And the grand jury has to decide whether to acquit you or whether to prosecute you. Most capital cases, like a murder trial, it has to go to trial. In some states, it has to go to trial. But do these laws always correspond to the people's sense of right and wrong? And this is the problem with the black letter laws. Obviously, on the reservation, speeding is not a problem, evidently, because, geez, I've passed cops, not very often. Every once in a while, I pass the cop and he just didn't even do anything. In Iowa, if you're driving, and usually I drive faster than the speed limit is 55, just like it is here. Just like it is here, if I pass a cop in Iowa, they turn on their flashers, tell me to, and they're trying to tell me to slow down. I usually do. I'll slow down to 60, but I'm still speeding. Kinda. But then again, it's a farming region, so you really shouldn't be going 80 miles an hour on a country road. In Iowa, you'll be running over the top of a hill and run into the back of somebody's tractor. so you can't really do that. Anyway, but they don't stop me. And when I was living in Oklahoma, I would drive home from work every day, and evidently this was a racetrack because there was somebody else that there was a factory that let out, and they drove the same road to Oklahoma City. I was driving from Chandler to Oklahoma City, and that goes through a couple different little towns. And evidently there's a factory in one of those towns because these guys are just flying down the road. This is in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's a lot like here. The roads aren't very wide. It's kind of up and down, so you can't see, you can't pass anybody. So people are going 80, 90 miles an hour. And I've been stopped going 80 when everybody else is going 90. But that's okay. It didn't bother me that much. I was speeding, so he was right. But I didn't get a ticket, and the reason I didn't get a ticket is because I'm so old. Usually they'll let old people off. They just want to stop the kids from driving because they don't have as much experience driving. And in Oklahoma, the kids this is a game that they play. They'll pull up on your bumper, and they'll sit there on your bumper for miles with, this much distance between you and the cops don't like that because it's kind of dangerous if you think about it. If I hit my brakes, they ran into the back of me. Now we have two cars that have crashed, and maybe we go flying off into the ionosphere, you never know. Anyway, okay. Okay, so we have a sense of right and wrong. We have this moral idea as to whether this is right or whether this is wrong. A good example would be euthanasia, where if somebody is suffering, we put them out of their misery, right? Isn't that the way it works? If you have an animal that's sick, if a horse breaks its leg, what do you do next?
Call the vet.
Yes, call the vet. What's the vet going to do? Geez, I can't, this break is too severe. Are there any such things as three-legged horses? There's three-legged dogs and three-legged cats, but not three-legged horses. No, it doesn't work. Or a cow. What are you going to do with a bovine that breaks its leg? Well, there's only one thing you can do, and that's to put them down. I mean, they can't function that way. Anyway, euthanasia. So do we do the same thing with humans? Or do we make it? We make them suffer. We just make them suffer. Is that right? Actually, there's 2 states where they can have assisted suicide. One's Oregon, the other's Massachusetts, I think. Another question, as far as right and wrong, is abortion. Is abortion right or is it wrong? Wow, this is a tough one. This is an argument that we've been having for, I don't know, about 100 years, I guess. They finally passed a law that said, yeah, let's go ahead and legalize abortion. But there's a lot of people in the United States that are really pissed off about it. And that group is fairly conservative, and they've been trying to manipulate politics so that they can do away with the abortion laws. So the question is it right or is it wrong? Or is it one of those issues that there is no right and wrong?
It's up to the individual.
Some people don't agree with that. When if the law says that they can abort a fetus, then they feel like they're murdering. Because they are part of the state, are condoning the murder of this baby. That's the way they feel. That's weird. No, that's not that weird, I guess. People have different ideas. Okay. And it's debatable. And these people will go to Washington and scream at each other, which is kind of fun, if you think about it. They rarely come to blows. That wouldn't make any sense. So there's people's sense of right or wrong, depending on your religion, depending on your point of view. This is a huge issue. If somebody's Catholic, the Catholic Church is against abortion. Does that mean you have to be against abortion? Well, that's part of the debate as well. As much fun as all this is.
Euthanasia and abortion highlights the inconsistency between legality and how many people's perception of what is moral, ethical, and just. And this is the question right here. Is it moral? Is abortion moral? Is it ethical? Is it just? It's just this huge question. My morality may be totally different than everybody else's. I was watching a silent movie last night. Silent movie. They stopped having silent movies in 1929. This was a silent movie that was made in 1927. It was made by Howard Hughes, whose morality was a little bit different. And there were nude scenes in this silent movie, and I was going. It was a silent film, and these. Well, it was just a naked woman. But I mean, we don't even see nudity in today's movies. Not very often. Not nearly like we saw in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was a lot of nudity in movies. Now all of a sudden there's no nudity anymore. As confusing as that is. I mean, I saw Aquaman. I don't think there was any nudity in Aquaman in any of the Marvel comics. So what's moral, what's ethical and just? This changes over time. So what was before the 1950s, before the 1970s, the morality in the United States dictated that there were no abortions. And then it all changed with Roe v. Wade in 1973. So are things going to go back to the way they were? Is that the new morality we have in the United States? Who gets to dictate what is moral and what's not moral? Who gets to be in charge? Do we get to vote on this? Well, we do every time we vote. This can be an issue. And of course, this comes up in different political campaigns. Gun laws, another morality, ethical, and just question. These, is the Second Amendment, is that absolute? What it says in the Second Amendment, which is fairly vague if you think about it. Of course, it was written in the 18th century, so do we take that into account? You can have all the muskets you want, guys. No AK-47s and AR-15s. Legislators and scholars have argued for centuries, and it's your fault. That law was written because of you guys. It's your fault. If it wasn't for you, that law would never have been written. Think about that.
Which law are you talking about?
Second Amendment, the one that right to keep and bear arms.
We weren't allowed.
It was your fault. You guys were the hostiles that they were.
It was.
It was written because they wanted to make sure that everybody had a gun, so that if they were attacked by, I've seen the movies, Stagecoach. I was watching. What was I watching the other? Oh, Searchers. The Searchers. Searchers is about a Comanche war party captures two girls, and for the next 15 years, this guy searches for his niece. That's not the strange part. And they were Comanches. They said they were Comanches in the beginning, and he was only chasing Comanches. So here he is. He's chasing these Comanches. They finally pin him down. They go into his camp, and guess what they're speaking in the Comanche camp? Navajo. It's Navajo. I know. I'm going, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I know Billigana when I hear it. He said Billigana. That's not a Comanche word. They don't speak Athabasca. Then he says, yeah, hey, wait a minute. Okay, anyway. They were speaking Navajo. I found that kind of cool, since I could understand what he was saying. And it wasn't Comanche at all. Comanche language is Caddo-Aztecian. It doesn't sound anything like Athabasca. Legislators and scholars have argued for centuries about whether or not the law should be consistent with the citizen's sense of morality. Recently, researchers have considered whether the principles of the model penal code are compatible with citizens' intuitions about justice and legality. A majority of the states base their criminal codes on the model penal code. And of course, this has to do with Joe Biden, strangely enough, because Joe Biden wrote laws back in the 1990s, got laws passed in the early 1990s, and these became our penal codes. And now Joe Biden is being excoriated, which means they slit his gut open and they spill his intestines out. That's what excoriated means. I know. Now he's not literally, of course. Now he's being attacked because of these laws that he wrote back in the 1990s, 25 years ago. As interesting as that is. But he's the one that came up with this model penal code. He was one of the individuals that came up with it. He was a prosecuting attorney. He was a young senator at that time. And now people are jumping all over him because of his laws, they've incarcerated a lot more people. And the vast majority of people being incarcerated in the United States are minorities rather than the majority population. So there's a lot of people that are pissed off at this model penal code that Joe Biden helped write back in the 1990s. As interesting as that is. So we'll see what happens, because the election is only 14 months away. No, how much fun is that?
I have a question on
Yeah.
that. If they have committed a crime that is punishable by incarceration, what is the big complaint, other than money, that to have people incarcerated?
That is the argument.
Oh, it's the money thing?
It's the money thing, sure.
So-
If it's a Kennedy that gets arrested for whatever, he doesn't go to jail.
No, he goes home.
He goes home, of course he does. If it's Jeffrey Epstein, who's got billions of dollars, he's able to get away with all kinds of weird, interesting things like human trafficking, like statutory rape, and he gets away with it down in Florida because he's wealthy. That's the problem. And not only that, but if you look at the justice system, if you're a minority, then the probability that you're going to be incarcerated is much higher than if you were not a minority, if you were from the dominant population.
So how do the people find the right senator or the right representative for Congress to change this law to fit the entire population?
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck, because what we have is, I mean, if you're looking at Arizona, who do you elect? John McCain?
I don't think so.
Well, he's dead, you're not going to elect him anyway. But you've got two Caucasian ladies that are running for Senate in the next election. Which one are you going to vote for, the Democrat or the Republican? Well, theoretically, the Democrat is more liberal than the Republican, but is that how you're going to choose who you're going to elect? And not only that, but you're only electing one person. I mean, there's 100 members of Congress. So the people in Minnesota get to decide who they're going to have in Congress. And your representative may agree with you, but that's only 1/100th of the sitting people. So the reality is that you can only deal with your representative. That's all you can deal with. Mitch McConnell may be the biggest criminal in the world, but nobody gets to decide whether Mitch McConnell is going to be a member of the Senate except the people of Kentucky. You have no control over anybody except people in your own state. The only people you get to vote for is the President of the United States and your representative. If you've got some asshole out there like Mitch McConnell that won't let laws come to the floor of the Senate to even be voted on, and he's the big criminal in this situation, there ain't nothing we can do about it. The only thing you can do is scream at your senator and tell her or him, whichever the case may be, that they need to get rid of Mitch McConnell. But it's a seniority system in the Senate, and he's in charge. And he gets to decide what laws come to the Senate floor. Isn't this fun? So they have gun laws, they have this, the House has passed these gun laws, and he won't let them be voted on in the Senate. So it doesn't really matter what the House says, because he's not gonna let it even come to the floor. He won't even let it come to the floor for debate. The only way that you can override him is to get 60 votes. I mean, you can filibuster, but the only way to break a filibuster, well, he won't even allow it to come to the floor. So the only way you can break that is with 60 votes. And there's not 60 Democrats or there's not 60 Republicans either. Anyway, how are we doing? Is it time yet? We're getting close. Let me do one more slide. The model penal code says that attempts should be punished in the same way as completed crimes. This means that what you intend to do is important. If you intended to murder somebody, you might as well have shot him and killed him, because intent is the same as the action. Darley, Sanderson, and La Mancha in 1996 found that people do not accept the view that intent to commit an act is the moral equivalent of actually doing it. So if you're planning on doing something, that's just as bad, according to the model penal code. So if you're a pickpocket and you actually pick somebody's pocket, but you didn't steal anything, is that the same? Or you weren't able to get away with it? Are you still a criminal? If you meant to commit a crime. I got a couple minutes. I've got a friend up in Montana, and he used to be on the rodeo circuit. And they used to ride from one rodeo to the next. You know, this is all over the north, Montana, North Dakota, Idaho. They'd go to rodeos all over the place. So they'd jump in the truck and they'd load their horses and they'd all take off for wherever. Well, sometimes they drank. Anyway, so one time they loaded up with, these two native guys loaded up with this guy from Canada. And so they're riding down the road and the guy says, well, let's stop and get some beers. So the two native guys had just lost the rodeo and they didn't have any money. And they said, okay, but you're gonna have to buy the beer. So he does. And of course he had won in the last rodeo. So he pulls out this whole roll of bills, it's making it bring a blood. But, and they're a little bit pissed off because he's this squirrely little guy and he keeps winning all this stuff. He's a bronc rider, and he's a bull rider, and he's a roper, and he just keeps winning, and it just kind of pisses him off. So they stop for the night, and they're drinking these beers, and they get pretty snockered, and they decide that they're going to murder him, and they're going to steal his money. So, of course, everybody's drunk, which is a lot of fun. Anyway, so they grab this stick, and they start beating him over the head with a stick, trying to kill him, and he's asleep, and he doesn't really wake up. And they're just wailing away on this guy, and they think they killed him. And then the next morning he wakes up, he's got lumps all over his head. And of course now they're sober, they were drunk the night before, and it was something that they thought that they might want to do that night. But they changed their mind, and they were really embarrassed, and they were hoping that he didn't believe it. So he couldn't figure out where all these lumps came from. And thank goodness they didn't murder him. So that's just intent. So should they have been arrested for murder? Those two guys beating him on the head with this rotten piece of wood. It turned out that it was rotten and they weren't really doing much damage. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. As much fun as that is.